and maybe I don't like this new thing, and maybe it's not good that my 13-year-old son can look at porn on his phone, but the broader progress delivered by capitalism is worth these like little hiccups of technology, right? That's just a completely terrible, wrong attitude. That's just dying slowly, right? That's just civilization dying slowly, is that attitude.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Marlo Slayback and Tom Saruf.
Today's guest is Professor John Askonas, who's an assistant professor of politics at the Catholic University of America, where he works on the connections between the Republican tradition, technology, and national security. He is currently working on 2 books, A Muse of Fire, Why the U.S. Military Forgets What It Learns in War, on what happens to wartime innovations when the war is over, and The Shot in the Dark, A History of the U.S. Army Asymmetric Warfare Group, which is the first comprehensive overview of a unit that helps the Army adapt to the post-9/11 era of counterinsurgency and global power competition. His writing has appeared in Foreign Policy, The New Atlantist, Fair Forward, War on the Rocks, Compact Magazine, and the Texas National Security Review. So welcome to the podcast, Professor. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me on.
Before we get started with our interview, we'd like to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Our mission is educating for liberty. If you would like to join us in fulfilling this mission, make sure to rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself. So thanks again for joining us today. John, you've been writing a lot recently about intersection between science, technology, and politics, and especially something that I think caught not only my eye, but a lot of my mutual followers on Twitter was a recent article you wrote for Compact. And it was called Why Conservatism Failed. So, a very eye-catching title right off the bat. And it focused on the conservative shortcomings with respect to technological transformation of society. So we'd love for you to tell us more about that concept and kind of, what drew you to writing and summing it up to that really, provocative, I guess, headline.
Yeah, thanks for asking. And of course, the wonderful title owes to the brilliant editors at Compact. My original title, which goes to the inspiration, was After Tradition, a riff on After Virtue by Alistair McIntyre. The piece was inspired by a kind of creeping a feeling that had been growing for years that conservatism and conservatives were ignoring the elephant in the room, which is that almost whatever kind of conservative you are, but especially if you're a social conservative or traditional conservative, your worldview and your politics are based on protecting a kind of actually existing social order, maybe oriented towards families, towards work and businesses and a culture and a community and a faith, etc. And the argument of the piece is simply that this kind of politics failed to protect those things, that we are living in an era where those kinds of traditions are substantially in collapse, which isn't really a controversial thing to say about any particular institution. But look, the point of the piece is that this is kind of comprehensive, and that this collapse comes directly from is a necessary effect of living in a technological society, which is to say a society which is always remaking its institutions, remaking how it does things. I was inspired in part by, in some ways, all that I'm saying is bringing an old argument from a Canadian philosopher named George Grant back to light. And Grant hated being called everyone called him a conservative, and he hated being called a conservative because he said it's impossible to be a conservative in a technological society. Now, the point of the piece is not, and we could talk more in depth about the argument and the kind of why we need to bring Marx back or embrace Marx on the right, at least as a descriptive or analytical thinker. But this is not meant to be a waving the white flag and declaring defeat. Rather, it's the recognition that we can't simply get by with the politics of protecting what actually exists, because what actually exists either no longer exists or is terrible. And we actually need to embrace the politics of understanding and deciding what is good and building what is good.
Yeah, so let's go. I want to go right for the Marx angle because you start your piece talking about, or by quoting, it's sort of at length, what you call conservatism's greatest nemesis, which is Karl Marx. And I would agree with that assessment that it is conservatism's greatest nemesis. I guess there are a lot of different angles we could take about embracing Marx or using Marx, but I'd love to hear, and this is something I've seen more and more within some circles of the right, is to use Marx or to draw from some of his insights. So I'd love to just hear your take about why you chose Marx and why you think Marx has to say that's valuable and useful for us as conservatives, despite his being sort of an enemy of tradition. But also why you might, maybe if you have some thoughts as to why you think Marx is getting a more positive reception amongst some conservatives more recently.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think the way to understand this is when the conservatives talk about and think about Marx, it's usually through the lens of communism as a program of sort of social transformation, especially in the 20th century with Bolshevism, the Soviet Union, communist China, etc. But that's sort of taking Marx forward, right? But what's interesting is what happens when you take Marx backward. Like, what was Marx a response to? There's this interesting tension in the modern conservative movement, which is, on the one hand, it's supposed to be giving, like, conservatism in all its sort of modern, at least European forms, gives voice to the instinct to protect this actually existing traditional order, perhaps, but not necessarily linked to some bigger transcendent order, against what? Against principally revolutionary ideology. So you get conservatism at the same time when you get people trying for really the first time to completely overhaul society, right? And you can trace this back to the French Revolution and some of the ideas that were going around before then, and then afterwards, various revolutionary ideologies, as well as a certain kind of sort of scientific pretension. We're going to remake society. This traditional order is irrational because it doesn't fit into a certain kind of way of knowing, a scientific way of knowing. We're going to remake society in scientific lines. Well, Marx is. So what's interesting is that even though we have we're interested in defending an actually existing order, the conservative movement has also been linked to a love of ideas, right? You have Russell Kirk's ideas of consequences. Conservatives love to talk about great ideas, great books, etc. The sort of Platonic sphere of the ideal, and I think Marx is an interesting person to deflate that tendency, right? Because Marx is responding to the young Hegelians. He's responding to idealism in German philosophy, that is sort of changing our ideas and conceptions about the world will lead into this dialectical process to an actual transformation of the world, right? And he thinks this is hogwash. And so he takes the other perspective, right, which is materialism. And I think it's Marx's materialism that conservatives need to better understand. I think there's a confusion, which is maybe a reasonable confusion in the 20th century between historical materialism and metaphysical materialism. So metaphysical materialism is kind of the new atheists, like all that exists are atoms, and we have to trace everything. Everything ultimately traces back to some physical or chemical process, and you don't have any free will, yada, yada, yada. That's not Marx's materialism at all. He's not really interested in that. His materialism is the notion that our ideas about society come ultimately from the material processes that actually make society. Chiefly, of course, what he calls the mode of production, which is the culture and roles in society and the ways of working that actually produce the social world. And the argument he makes is that change in human society comes not by changing ideas, but by changes in these processes, which are slow. They occur through, the different parts of society, different classes are contending for their own kind of economic or individual advantage. And over time, who wins at that material level of like control over resources, control over production, actually changes society. It changes ideas about society as well. And the reason this is really useful and then is that he highlights the distinctive difference of living in a technological society, which is to say, one of the things, the reason why Marx and Marxists think that capitalism is the gateway to communism and the end of history is that capitalism, a capitalistic society, is the first society where the ruling class, as it were, has an interest in and is always changing the mode of production, changing the social processes that put it in power. Right? Every other society beforehand, the ruling class was inherently conservative. Right? It was in charge. It was, it's good to be king. You don't want to upset the apple cart. Right? Capitalism is the first system in which that's not the case. And so Marx's materialist analysis immediately brings us to the problem of technology and the way that technological change overthrows the social order. Necessarily so, yeah.
And could you maybe give any examples that would be relevant today on how, just in maybe less abstract terms, and how we're seeing this, especially, I was reading a piece in the Wall Street Journal that just kind of comes to mind, maybe kind of tangential, but I think it's worth mentioning, about, I think it was titled like, "Where Have the Go-Getters Gone?" And I'm not sure if you read it, but the gist of it is—
No, I didn't see it.
Yeah. So, with especially after COVID and younger generations, when compared to their parents' generations, seem to be just trying to get by rather than trying to, ascend, whether that's class or class ascendancy or, simply, I think on TikTok, actually, one of the women who was interviewed said that she learned the phrase "actor wage." And it just brought to mind like this it's a very materialist kind of intersection with the proliferation of technology, and that it's being used in such ways to like pay to you. We'll use on Marxist terms again to kind of at the benefit of the proletariat classes, right? So I'm interested in kind of what your thoughts are on some of these different elements of society that are cropping up because of technology and social media, which is relevant to, I'm sure our listeners, but especially our students today, where like a few years ago, TikTok wasn't as relevant as it is today, but now it's like actually influencing how people negotiate salaries, right? So interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and to be clear, like, while I think Marx's paradigm of class conflict is interesting, I don't think it's the most important thing about understanding what Marx has to offer for us. I think that focus on how the way that we live and kind of the material conditions of our living change our ideas, change what is possible for us, and therefore what we desire. I think that's kind of more fundamental. So here's an example along similar lines, right? At this point in the United States, something like 50% of couples meet online, mostly through a handful of apps, right? This is an unprecedented change in human mating behavior, right? Looking back, I think in the future archaeologists and anthropologists will see this moment as a signal event in the history of the human species. And yet, hardly anybody, and certainly in conservative circles, hardly anybody talks about it as something of that degree of importance. Why? Well, it wasn't really accompanied by a change in ideas, right? It didn't come from, nobody was advocating for this. It simply became a technological possibility. It linked into a number of other technological changes in society, right? A certain degree of atomization, a certain degree of collapse of other institutions which otherwise would permit or help couples meet or whatever, and then it became a fact, right? Nobody argued for it. It just became a fact, right? That's the kind of social change that technology can bring. And if you're a conservative, like what are you supposed to do about that if your attitude is simply defending tradition, right? If you're just simply defending tradition of like, oh, people should meet at church, well, guess what? It's not happening. It's not going to be happening. Now, so what we have to do instead is think like, what are the goods that we want to achieve and how people meet, and the fact that people should meet, they should get married, and then build institutions or norms or technologies to help get us there. And I know a few conservatives who are working on new dating apps where which aren't just like, it's not just like dating for conservatives, but it's actually a dating app, not built for conservatives, but where the fundamental affordances of the app are aimed towards getting together quickly and getting married rather than, flitting around ad infinitum, which is sort of the design of a Tinder or a Hinge or whatever.
Well, as a young conservative, I would love to hear more about those dating apps that at the fundamental level are rooted in a set of conservative ideas or conservative principles and trying to translate that into material reality. But something else I'm seeing more within some conservative circles is like maybe a reconceptualization or a retooling of the marriage between conservatism and capitalism, because it sounds a little bit like the idea that technological possibility of, say, this dating app and the whole panoply of dating apps is also there's a business model behind it, and it's harnessing private industry to make that. There's advertising, marketing, and I think the marketing and advertising thing is something that we can get to a little bit later. But just at a more general level of analysis, I think the mainstream conservative political position has been to defend capitalism, to defend private industry, free markets, and all of the innovation, productivity gains that are realized as a result of private industry and innovation. And so that's been to champion, say, big business, and even at the, offshoring has been a byproduct of that, but to champion that, this is the growth of efficiency, better ways of doing things. But I'd love to hear your perspective as to what the future of conservatism's relationship should be to capitalism and what the relationship should be there from a political theory perspective.
Yeah, and the app I mentioned is called Keeper. The URL is keeper.dating. You can go check it out. It's sort of in its infancy, but you could beta test it, and maybe there's already been one marriage to come out of it, so hopefully there'll be more soon. And I should stipulate I'm not a political theorist, and I think we need more people who are not political theorists talking about these questions. My background is much more in international relations, political economy. But to your question, I think this is certainly one of the defining questions in the conservative movement right now. I think that the assumption when this, as you put it, this marriage between kind of capitalism and conservatism came about was that they were both defending these kinds of implicit bottom-up organic orders, right? That's the connection between. If you read Hayek on the market order, this is what he's trying to give voice to. At a time when you had the current thing was a pretension towards scientific management, not just in government but also in business, right? That there was something inefficient about having all these companies building things all these different ways, and I think those claims stand, right? The notion that there is something ineradicably human and organic about how we do business is true. Where I think the mistake occurred was missing the extent to which the pursuit of profit alone was inherently transformative of the social order, right? And there's nothing. So, what does this mean for conservatives today? Well, first, capitalism can take care of itself. I mean, if I had one message for conservatives, it would be this: communism. To some extent, yes, we have to continue to fight against this pretension towards scientific management. I mean, I think conservatives of all stripes, for example, are weirded out by ESG for different reasons. But I think that's the right intuition. But other than that, capitalism could take care of itself. Yes, blue laws and forbidding work on Sundays or strong maternity leave policies are unprofitable for businesses. But the whole point of capitalism is that in any given regulatory regime, businesses will find the ways to be the most profitable. So do what is good and let businesses and ensure that businesses have the regulatory freedom to adapt to those changing realities. Don't be afraid of changing that reality. The other thing to keep in mind is that business was not, capitalism, while it was socially transformative even in the 19th century, this really tight feedback loop of connection to the scientific and technological development regime is a new phenomenon, right? Especially after the Second World War, where you have a massive state investment in new science and in new technology, often military technology. That's my kind of academic bread and butter. And then that's all getting spun off into the private sector, right? And that's when I think that's where you see this massive, next level transformation of the entire human social order, with very little input from any individual, very little, it wasn't like we as a society decided this is how we want to proceed, right? And so I think now that we are aware of the kind of technological nature of capitalism, that's another area where conservatives could, if they want to be conservatives or if they want to defend something about human nature, something about what makes us human, that's an area where they have to push back against the market's simple pursuit of profit.
What's your impression of how conservatives are approaching technology and innovation today? Because, I mean, my husband works in for a venture capital fund that, invests in budding technology, and, their thesis is primarily focused on college dropouts. So that's quite niche, but, Peter Thiel has the concept of, and he's spoken about this before, I think with Hoover, if anyone's interested in watching it, but about technological stagnation and stagflation, and these terms have kind of cropped up. And I think a lot of conservatives have divided themselves among the technological optimists and the pessimists. So I'm curious where you would consider yourself, and a lot of these people maybe don't too neatly define themselves as conservatives one way or the other, but maybe they have general gripes with kind of how. I mean, you've talked about anti-reality before, so anti-realism, how rooted it's become in that, and maybe there are aspects of traditions that they want to reinvigorate in American culture. So what's your sense about how conservatives approach the concept of technology altogether, and are we right to be pessimists or optimists right now? It sounds like you're saying you're kind of pessimistic given the title of your compact piece, but I'd love for you to expand on that.
Yeah, well, I hope my goal is to be an optimist, right? And I think that hope, and especially Christian hope, is just the most important thing for humanity and humanity's relationship to technology. So I think there's, speaking of the broader conservative movement, I would say that there have been two fundamental attitudes towards technology, both of which are wrong, both of which are, as the kids say, NGMI, not going to make it. The first, which I think is probably the broader in American society as a whole, among people who sort of lean right of center, is basically blithe technological naivete. New technologies are going to come out, and it's basically a good thing. And gee whiz, isn't it cool that we can do this now? And maybe I don't like this new thing, and maybe it's not good that my 13-year-old son can look at porn on his phone, but the broader progress delivered by capitalism is worth these little hiccups of technology, right? That's just a completely terrible, wrong attitude. That's just dying slowly, right? That's just civilization dying slowly, is that attitude. And maybe it's, maybe the frog is boiling more quickly than it can feel, but it's boiling. The other attitude, which has always been there in the conservative movement, has always been a minority, is the kind of, as you put it, technological pessimism, right? The long defeat approach, right? Everything is getting worse, and, men don't wear suits anymore, and, relations between the sexes are completely fraught, and, wasn't it better when people read more books instead of watching television or TikTok or whatever? And there is a real intuition to that. Right? That is the intuition that technology is transforming culture and often destroying culture, destroying tradition, destroying good things, right? But the reason that approach is not going to make it is it doesn't have a serious. There are two. Once you have that realization, the realization that a technological society cannot have traditions, cannot have conservatism meaningfully, then you have two options. One, which I do not endorse, although I empathize with, is the Ted Kaczynski option, the Luddism option, the destroy the industrial society option. The other option is to build your way out of it, to actually try to grasp the sword of technological development, try to recognize the need to rein it in or prevent it in certain areas, to accelerate it in other areas. And that's what I'm trying to put forward in this piece. That, being a conservative in a technological society, or to put it another way, being someone who believes in human nature and human order and the order of things in technological society, means using every instrument we have to build that order, to fight off lines of technological development that are destructive of that order, and to try to advance and accelerate those that are supportive of that order. And this is, to my mind, this is I haven't found very many people who are really trying to fully make sense of this position. I do think that, the work that 1517 Fund is doing, that Peter Thiel is doing, I don't necessarily agree with everything that they do or say, but they realize this is a better direction than the Ted Kaczynski option.
I want to ask about your writing in the New Atlantis on post-reality, the sort of series you did over the summer. But before I do that, just because you really hit on a very interesting point, I think a lot of people, maybe, I don't know if it's safe to say most people in America, sort of want what you're describing, which I would say is like, I don't want to go back to hand washing clothes or getting rid of refrigeration and dishwashers. I don't have a dishwasher in my apartment. I hate it. That's a wonderful technology, but also it does change the way you live your life, the sort of pattern and rhythm of everyday life. And, especially for women, Jordan Peterson has talked about, he sort of rebutted the idea that, a bunch of feminists got together and revolutionized things for women. Actually, no, it was this sort of technological change that these time-saving devices, but I think everyone sort of likes a lot of the conveniences, the comfortable material conditions that have been ushered in by the modern world, capitalism, these things that we've been talking about. But they would like to, at least amongst the conservatives among us, would like to combine all of those material conditions and creature comforts with the traditional society, the strong moral compass, good values, strong family values, all of that. And so I think you're hopeful that this is a legitimate possibility, but I'd love for you to say a bit more about what that actually looks like in practice, or if you have suggestions on what we could build to make that a reality.
Yeah, and I think as with many things, what any atomized individual can do is to advance this is much less than what a community can do, much less than what a culture and a movement and a state can do. But that being said, I think you're exactly right, and I think. But again, because conservatism hasn't grappled with the problem of technology, it hasn't made this explicit. One of the things it means to live in a society after tradition is that norms and values and wisdom about these things are not handed down to you. They're not handed down either because that connection has been broken, or because it doesn't really seem to apply any longer. Right? The smartphone's a hugely transformative technology that's like 10 years old, a little more than 10 years old. There isn't nobody's. At least until very recently, nobody's father or grandfather has advice on how do you live with this technology? How do you stop it from taking over your life? How do you use it well, right? So that's just one tiny example of something that is pervasively true in our culture. So what I think this means is community, and this is why I think, I'm sort of bullish on religion and faith of all kinds, is that it's if you look across the landscape of like what are things that people believe in strong enough to restrain their use of technology, religion's easily the very top of the list, right? You can look at how Orthodox Jews, or on the Sabbath, or the Amish, or the Mennonites, or in much smaller ways like Mormons or Catholics, and the ways that they do and do not use certain technologies as instructed by their faith. Is I think a kind of not that you have to join those faiths, but that's an instructive way to think about what does it look like. So just to use a brief example, based on what you said, I think we need communities that have norms, not even norms, but also just like ideas and wisdom and tips on these are the technologies you need to live this way. These are the technologies that are harmful to living this way. A conservative movement or an intellectual movement that is evangelizing and popularizing these things, and writers who are writing about these things, the state that could subsidize these things. Like, for example, like the state should give every family, when they have a kid, a deep freezer. Like that would be one like very like pro technology, pro family policy. Get everybody a deep freezer. It helps you prepare food for longer periods of time, make food at home and save it for longer periods of time, right? Changes your relationship to food. I said another podcast, like the state could tax microwaves. Like tax the microwave, subsidize the deep freezer. That is a conservative technology policy. Just one kind of tiny example, but this is what it would look like, I think, to have a conservative movement that really tried to embrace and understand technology.
It's funny you mentioned that because we're actually looking for a deep freezer right now. And we last year got married, then we moved twice, and now we have a baby, and the thing that we need and we bought a house and we're like, we need a deep freezer and we hardly touch our microwave. So I'm on board with any party that supports that platform. And I wanted to like promote, but also mention as part of a question, an ongoing, we try to do it on a semesterly basis, but last year we did our technology webinar series, which was like 6 weeks long, and we did it again in the fall. But in the last spring, the book that was kind of the anchor of the series was, I think that was this fall, was Revolt of the Public by Martin Gurry. So it was this fall, right, Tom, that we did Gurry? Yeah, I forget which, we did the post in the book in the spring. But in Revolt of the Public, Gurry talks about how social media networks and massive information pathways and sources have revolutionized society. I can't talk today. And so you have these vital communities that crop up, but they essentially are mimicking, echo chambers because they form around a shared set of sources of information. And so you form these communities, and I'm sure anyone listening to this podcast can relate on some, especially if you're on Twitter, like these communities they become so cohesive so quickly, whether that's the algorithm or, you're selecting for finding other individuals, or maybe you're even, I know conservatives especially all have their kind of subgroups on the internet. So I'm curious what, in your work on post-reality, you arguing that even before social media, this was happening. Could you talk about that more?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I do think that a lot of the analysis of the change we're all living through and how we communicate, how we convene together, the analysis has been too driven by social media. Really, social media was simply the killer app that got everybody on the internet. What mattered for social media was not the technology, which wasn't really that new or sophisticated, but the fact that you had a lot of people that never used the internet before, hardly used it before, it suddenly became an important part of their life. Like I was in high school when Facebook became important, and I was a bit of a nerd, so I was already using the internet for different things. And there was that transitional period of instant messenger protocols. Although what was unique about those was they were quite, they tended to kind of mimic at real world social networks at first, right? As did social media. But it was really social media, the fear of missing out of there's a social world happening online. The most important thing about that was not any new technology, but simply getting everybody online, which is kind of where we are now. The more meaningful shift, the kind of paradigm shift, which is at least as important as the printing press and possibly as important as like the written alphabet, was a shift from, and this is what I say in my series in New Atlantis, which is only a quarter of the way through. We've got a couple more essays coming out, hopefully in the new year. It's a deep dive in different areas of this, but it's not that different from what Martin Gurry is saying. Is a shift from one to many communications, which had been the pattern from the printing press onward, and had really kind of reached its height in the late 20th century, to many communications. Where one of the side effects is you can form more, what I guess you today call parasocial relationships. So you shift from one to many communications, which allows you to have meaningful community relationships online. It makes it easier. The cost of entry for anyone to begin to communicate goes to zero. And what that means is that people whose ideas were never really reflected in a one-to-many pattern, can suddenly have a real audience, and they can find, and this is where I think Google and the social media is important, is it makes it much easier to find your people, right? It's a search engine for people and for ideas, right? It helps people find people. It also helps businesses find people. That's where the money comes from in advertising. It also helps ideas find people. The example I like to give is there's a cult, Heaven's Gate cult, is famous for everybody committing suicide because they thought they were going to go up to this UFO. Well, the cult got started in the early 70s, and it basically took them 20 years to find enough people. Because the only way to find people who want to join this cult was to literally go around UFO conventions all over the country trying to recruit people, right? It's unbelievably labor intensive. Well, now it'd be much more easy to find people, which is, by the way, I think, among other things, we're entering a new golden age of cults and like new religious movements. I just think it hasn't quite, I think they've already probably started, but we haven't quite caught onto it yet. But anyways, so this shift from a one-to-many to a many-to-many model is also what's destroying or has destroyed our sense of like a shared reality. I think the sense of like there are institutions, they speak with one voice, they speak the truth, we all basically agree on that truth, was basically a byproduct of one-to-many communication systems, radio, television, the newspapers, and of the business model, which encouraged real sort of mass aiming for the median news coverage and opinion analysis, so the advertising business model. And that's all been completely destroyed. And so even institutions which predated this shift, like the New York Times, CNN, PBS, their incentives have radically changed, and their behavior has begun to reflect those incentives. So we can talk more about that if you want, but that's the kind of basic idea.
Yeah, I'm seeing we don't like to keep these going on for too long, so maybe I'll ask one more question to close. In that along the same line with the sort of post-reality, we've lost this sense of a cohesive, unified sense of reality, if not a sense of the good life or a unified sense of American patriotism. But back in the day, you used to have sort of fairness or balancing regulations on the air. And part of your series, you mentioned that this creates sort of a fakeness or a scripted conception or a scripted or a scripted landscape. I think is the proper way of phrasing it is a scripted landscape, almost like WWE, but for cable television. So you have CNN's Crossfire is the example you use, is you have a left versus right talk show, and they're sort of battling it out. But at the end of the day, this is a sort of corporate, eye-grabbing entertainment style news, and Jon Stewart comes along and exposes how fake that is. And his whole shtick is, oh, we're fake news, but really you're not different than any other form of news. But given this, we don't have that anymore, and it's obvious, and it's increasingly obvious to people even on the left, like my family members who are on the left, are even recognizing like, oh yeah, CNN is completely fake, totally slanted, in a way that it doesn't. That's just broken down, and it's only a microcosm of one particular worldview. But I'd love to know: can we put the toothpaste back in the tube, so to speak? If the shattering of reality is a result of policy choices or certain technological innovations, how do we move forward as a United States of America if we don't have a shared vision of reality? I hope that question makes sense. There's a lot there.
No, it makes total sense. And I think this is an area where the United States has some unique advantages, right? So in some states, like Lithuania or Estonia, for example, the combination of like a small language and a relatively small population size means that you can rebuild. You don't have you won't necessarily have the overarching broadcast apparatus that's generating unity, but you have like real organic sources of unity, right? The United States is too big for that, but we have other things going for us, right? The United States has always had federalism. The United States has always had a really pluralistic society. The kind of unity we had in the 20th century was, if anything, the aberration, right? It was really an aberration to have one group of people that claimed to speak for the nation as a whole, right? And I think, frankly, it was a bad aberration. I don't look back on this period of unity with a lot of nostalgia. I think it actually led to bad policies. I think it actually led to the construction of, or was part of a construction of a kind of national elite the United States never had, and that's fundamentally un-Republican, small r Republican. So I'm looking forward to a return to pluralism. The challenge now is, what does pluralism look like when the pluralism is not primarily geographic? It's primarily like an ideational pluralism, it's a communal pluralism. And that to me is the big question. One part of this is simply going to be geographical sorting. We're already seeing this at an unprecedented scale of economic or migration, which is, if you really dig down, not just about economic opportunity, but also about values and their sense of reality, right? So you can imagine the challenge now is that we have all these national institutions which we can have to contend over, which have an unbelievable amount of power to coerce, state and local communities that might have different sets of values. So I think if we can find ways to deconstruct or rein in that kind of coercive power and live together and agree to live together in where we don't agree on many of these issues, I think we can survive this transition. The other thing I'll say is that this is something that's going to become a little clearer in a piece I'm working on now, is that, to some extent, when the printing press and when the printing press and the Protestant Reformation exposed a huge amount of political pluralism, one solution was to develop institutions which still worked if you didn't have like shared metaphysical assumptions, right? So what I think now is we're in need of new institutions, new protocols that still work, even if we don't agree on, don't have a shared sense of reality. If we can agree on a few, thin priors, then I think, and build institutions around those, then maybe we can go through this. So one example might be, for reasons good and bad, there might be a huge amount of distrust about election and kind of the social procedures involved in vote counting, right? Well, on the one hand, simply doing things like improving our existing adversarial system of keeping tabs on the vote, improving the technologies and the assurance of the technologies that go into counting votes, and maybe even doing things like, this is one interesting example of things like the blockchain and distributed ledgers, is that you can agree on like a few mathematical principles, then you can disagree about everything else, and still hold it up as a kind of valid thing. So I do think there are kind of some practical solutions to some of these problems that involve creating new institutions to deal with the reality of this sort of loss of shared trust. But the important leap to make then is this conceptual leap from trying to shore up these institutions, which is where we are now, this discourse about misinformation. This is all just like, trying to rearranging deck chairs in the Titanic, right? We have to make the leap to actually building institutions that are fitted for this kind of post-consensus reality.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, John. Thanks so much for joining us. And you mentioned a few of your pieces, which we will plug in the show notes, but where else can our listeners follow you, find your work? Where else can we see your writing?
Yeah, you can. So most of our work appears at the New Atlantis, or this big series, the New Atlantis. I also written for Compact. I have a few other things in the works for this year. The easiest way to keep track of my writing is probably just to follow me on Twitter, because I'll definitely put everything that I write on Twitter, although I'm resolving to use Twitter less as a social network for this year.
Great. Well, thanks so much again for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to head over to isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, ISI books, and of course this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.